Shrink, there's nothing wrong with you that can't be cured with a little Prozac and a polo mallet.
It's reading Balzac, looking at Prozac. It's a helping hand that makes you feel wonderfully.
Here we go. Here comes the Prozac.
Scientific studies have linked antidepressants such as Prozac to suicidal thoughts and actions, especially among young adults between the ages of 18 to 24.
The difference between the effect of a placebo and the effect of an antidepressant is minimal for most people.
So you're saying if they took a sugar pill, they'd have the same effect?
Hello, welcome. I'm Ben Boyce. And today's episode is about the hardest thing that I've ever had to accept about drugs. They don't get everyone high the same way. In fact, I still struggle to accept that truth about how drugs work because I, like you, am a human. I have experiences with drugs, and I know in my guts that shooting cocaine is a rush incomparable to anything else I've ever done. And I know that heroin and fentanyl bring me intense relief from anxiety and an alert peace of mind that makes me want to go out and do stuff. Those are my experiential memories of using drugs, but they vary a great deal from our cultural and medical understanding of those same drugs. And that's the topic of today's episode: placebo effects, placebo texts, and why what we know about a drug has everything to do with what we experience when we take it. A quick reminder that I'm not a medical doctor, and this is not a medical advice podcast, but I am a doctor of communication, and today's episode, like most, is about how we communicate. It's about the stories we tell about the drugs we take, and the way those stories impact the experience. In the United States nowadays, we tend to think about drugs in terms of both cultural stigma and pharmacological effects. For example, SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they're somehow still culturally understood to be powerful cures for anxiety or depression. They're medically understood to reduce the brain's reuptake of serotonin, causing more of the neurotransmitter commonly associated with well-being to remain in the synapses between the neurons, an effect which, according to our doctors, brings us relief from depression. But there's an obvious problem that shows up right away with both of these stories about SSRIs, one that points back to the subject of today's episode. SSRIs increase the level of serotonin in our brains really fast, like within a day or two after we start to take them. But most of those who take them don't notice any real improvements for a month or more. The improvement clearly doesn't come directly from the increase in serotonin. Otherwise, it would show up right away, like happens with drugs like MDMA or cocaine, drugs that also boost serotonin levels. Our understanding of so-called antidepressants, SSRIs, it's still incomplete, but the story we use to explain what we don't quite understand, it's rock solid, and it's clearly nonsense. The closer we look, the more it's really starting to look like SSRIs are placebo drugs of a sort. But SSRIs are in good company, because every drug is a placebo drug. You're always taking it with a set of expectations, stories, guidance, and of course, your set and setting. Those things all impact your experience with the drug as much, if not more, than the drug itself. That doesn't mean that SSRIs don't work for some people, and if they're working for you, great, keep taking them. It just means that a straight pharmacological understanding of drugs is far from enough to understand what's really happening when we take any drug. Now, I've talked about set and setting quite a lot on this podcast, but it's always worth a quick review, especially given today's topic. Set is just the stage, so to speak, the place where you plan to use a substance or to do something else. The house or the forest you're in, along with the music playing, the people around you, and the overall atmosphere. The casino only feels like the casino because of set. Smoky smell, loud noises, distracting layout, huge spaces, and you have to drive to get there. It's all a package deal. Plus, you're actually putting money on the line whenever you gamble. I have a couple slot machines at my house that I brought back from Vegas once upon a time, and unfortunately, they're not at all the same thing as playing in Vegas. It's good practice, but it's far from a replacement. The set is not the same no matter how hard I try to pretend that it is. So the experience of the drug, playing a slot machine, it isn't the same either. Setting, on the other hand, is you. It's your life experience, your state of mind, your neural makeup, and of course, along with that, it's everything you already believe about a drug or a behavior you're about to partake in. If you've been led to believe your entire life that gambling is evil, and that anyone who does it will wind up madly addicted, you'll have a very different experience than someone who has a very different story. If you've been led to believe that MMA fighting is acceptable, and that beating people up for the amusement of others is okay, as long as the fighters are in a cage surrounded by bloodlusting fans, you'll have a very different experience than someone who's been given a different story, say, one that explains humans as intrinsically good and therefore places violence and causing pain to others as outside acceptable behaviors. Placebos define our humanity. Our stories decide how we experience an event. Set and setting are always more important than the drug you're taking or the thing that you're doing. One good example of this is a rat study in which sibling rats are both hooked up to IV cocaine injection machines that would give them a hit of cocaine whenever one of them pushed the button. But instead of giving both rats a button to push, researchers only gave one rat a button. They still gave both rats cocaine, but only one of them got to choose how often and how much. And when they could trick that rat into pushing the button, because it's not as easy as simply making cocaine available, they would give a steady dose to that rat, along with the same dose to his brother or sister next door, the one who didn't push the button. So the button-pushing rat got to get as high as he wanted, as long as he wanted, and the sibling was just along for the ride. So if the researchers removed all other stimulation and friends from the cage, so the rat was incredibly bored, well then it would push the button on a regular basis, but only when devoid of all those other options for stimulation that would have prevented it from pushing the button, like sugary food or sex partners. But when he pushed the button, he got a dose of cocaine, he walked around for a while, and then maybe he pushed the button again, or maybe he went and lay down and took a nap. The rat never overdosed in this study, even when he took cocaine regularly and in rather high doses. But his sibling, on the other hand, she died at doses the button pusher could withstand, and doses he apparently enjoyed. Simply pushing the button and knowing that a dose is coming changes your experience on drugs like cocaine, from an enjoyable one that you might want to repeat to a possibly deadly one that was probably really confusing to boot. Now, this might sound incredible if you love a particular drug and you can't imagine a world where it doesn't actually cause the effect in your body so much as you and the drug work that out as a team. But that's a lot closer to what actually happens when you take a drug. Any drug. In fact, you don't even have to take a drug for it to happen. That's how powerful the placebo effect is, and how easy it is to fool humans. Before I move too far away from SSRIs, I want to share why I don't take them. I tried once. I was prescribed Prozac shortly after I was released from prison, and I took it the first day as instructed, but within an hour, I felt like I was tripping acid, and not in a good way. I described it to my doctor later in the best way I could, as feeling like I was a car with my front bumper pressed against a brick wall, pushing, but not moving. Just pure, tense. By this point, it had been 2 weeks since I took that one dose, and I'd returned to normal, if there is such a thing, but my doctor acted incredibly surprised. I've never heard of anyone having that happen from an SSRI, she said. It'd be another 10 years before I realized just how incredibly difficult it would have been for her to be telling the truth.
You know when you feel the weight of sadness. You may feel exhausted, hopeless, and anxious, and don't enjoy the things you once loved. Things just don't feel like they used to. These are some symptoms of depression, a serious medical condition affecting over 20 million Americans. While the cause is unknown, depression may be related to an imbalance of natural chemicals between nerve cells in the brain.
So-called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors hit the market in 1987, with Prozac, or fluoxetine as the drug's called, becoming the first of many. And it didn't take long for doctors who were prescribing it to report something called akathisia, that thing I experienced but was told was an oddity, when SSRIs make some of us freak out. By 1990, the lawsuits were already flying, claiming that it caused some people to murder their families, kill themselves, or even commit bizarre crimes completely out of character.
We begin with charges against the biggest selling antidepressant in the world. 3 years ago, Prozac hit the market in a whirlwind of publicity and praise. Today, more than 3.5 million patients worldwide are treated with Prozac. But there are new concerns about the drug, allegations it can cause some people to act violently, to commit suicide or even homicide. More than 50 civil suits have been filed against Eli Lilly, the company that makes the drug. And now the so-called Prozac defense is being used in criminal trials.
The manufacturer settled a lot of these suits early on, but they just kept coming. In 1995, a man shot up his job and killed 20 people. In 1999, another case went to trial where a man killed his wife and himself. And by then, studies had already shown that a minority of Prozac users experience agitation, that akathisia like I had. But the makers managed to minimize this concern by suggesting that doctors prescribe benzodiazepines like Xanax or Valium at the same time that they prescribe Prozac. If you go back and look at the original studies that were used by Lilly to get Prozac approved, 25% of the participants in those studies were on a benzodiazepine at the same time. That's the only reason Prozac was approved in the first place. But somehow, this little piece of advice appears to have not made its way to my doctor and to lots of other doctors just like her, probably for obvious reasons. Doctors hesitate to prescribe benzos with SSRIs when SSRIs were supposed to offer a safe alternative to benzodiazepines. But the 1999 case wasn't new news. In 1986, clinical trial studies comparing Prozac with other antidepressants showed a rate of 12.5 suicides per 1,000 participants on Prozac, compared to only 3.8 suicides per 1,000 participants who were taking older non-SSRI antidepressants, and only 2.5 per 1,000 who were taking a placebo pill. But what the hell? This was advertised as a new miracle wonder drug that we were all told would outperform all previous drugs. How is it possible that it's actually worse? Now, since then, tons of people have tried to kill themselves on Prozac in peer-reviewed cases all the way back to the 1990s. Yet I was given it without any warnings or any benzos, and so are millions of other patients. Prozac and other SSRIs rely on a pharmacological understanding of drugs. The false story that set and setting are irrelevant and that only the chemicals that we're taking matter. We all know this isn't true, but we'd still run our pharmaceutical industry in the United States like it is true. We have a DSM that specifies hundreds of conditions that can be treated with thousands of chemicals, regardless of who the person being treated is. It's a one-size-fits-all system, but humans aren't one size. And of course, the pharma companies know this too. Lilly actually tried to defend themselves in court at one point with the argument that the guy who killed his coworkers must have had a history that made him more likely to commit violence. Almost like they thought that made a difference in how the drug would impact someone who took it. Imagine that. In other words, SSRIs are sold on the claim that virtually anyone who takes them will have the same reaction regardless of who they are and what they've experienced, that a drug is a drug and always does the same thing. But manufacturers also feel comfortable claiming, when it helps them, that it's possible for some people to take these drugs and, based on their past or their genetics or their identity, their individuality, their set and setting, some folks might have a negative reaction to the drug that they claim no one has a negative reaction to. It actually gets worse. From the start, they used PR to create the term SSRI, then to ignore the other things these drugs do, like increase dopamine or reduce serotonin in certain parts of the brain with long-term use. They instead hyped them as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors to to distinguish them from other drugs that also restrict uptake of both serotonin and norepinephrine. But there's nothing selective about them. They just reduce the reuptake of serotonin. Even the name is a placebo. That name was based on the precursors to SSRIs, the most well-known of which was a drug called imipramine. It was hugely popular before Prozac and other SSRIs hit the market. But near the 1980s, it fell out of favor as a, quote, dirty drug because it not only raised serotonin levels in the brain, but also norepinephrine levels, adrenaline. So researchers headed back into the lab to replace the drug consumers were moving away from, and SSRIs are what they came up with to keep the machine of Big Pharma moving forward. That's the story of drugs in the United States. We've constantly followed a model I mentioned last episode. A drug is introduced as a miracle cure to all sorts of things that sound incredible, so lots of people start to take it and they experience positive results. Then the negative results start to make news, causing a reevaluation of the original effects and a decrease in the success stories that were once easy to find, placebo effects being what they are. And once people start to hear the horror stories, their personal beliefs about the drug change. And of course, that impacts their experience too. So the drug is discredited or even banned outright, and pharma companies hit the lab to create a similar or even an identical drug that can take the place of the original miracle cure, starting the whole process over. And it all started way back in the 1800s, when drugs like heroin, cocaine, morphine, and cannabis, all relatively natural compared to the purely synthetic pharmaceuticals more typical nowadays, they were all legal, cheap, and easy to find. They were the original drugs first praised as miracle cures and sold as cure-alls for everything, then stigmatized and blamed for our cultural problems, and then finally synthesized and replaced by new chemicals that would also follow that predictable path. The original drug laws only got off the ground because of clever politicians who knew how to stoke up the racist and sexist resentments of the public. Cannabis, which was available in tinctures and medicines as a pain reliever or an anti-anxiety drug, it was rebranded as marijuana and associated with Mexican immigrants who whites across the South already disliked and feared. Then the final piece, which is most important, both the drug and the group of people were duct taped to some awful behavior that almost everyone would oppose: rape, murder, violence, theft, child corruption, things like that. And once the duct taping was complete, the original stereotypes associated with race could be dropped and forgotten in favor of stronger, longer-lasting fears concerning murder and mayhem. With marijuana, it was stories many of us have seen in films like Reefer Madness, or the news reports of Victor Licata, who was a mentally ill man convicted of killing his family with an axe, who wound up plastered on newspapers across the country as an example of what marijuana will do, even though no marijuana was ever found in his system. With opium, it was Chinese and other East Asian immigrants working in the western United States who were accused of corrupting or even sexually assaulting white women, a claim that duct taped both they and opium smoking to the fear of sexual assault. And of course, ironically, as we learned last episode, the practice of smoking opium, whereas whites in the US usually drank ours or took it in a pill, that was originally popularized in China by European traders who were smuggling it in for illegal profit. But once it came back to the US, we stigmatized and feared it. With cocaine, the association was to black folks in the South. Both they and cocaine were duct taped to criminal desires and unstoppable strength, which was alleged to be a side effect of taking the drug. Many Southern police departments actually upgraded the size of their pistols to combat what they were told cocaine could do to some black folks, make them superhuman and immune to bullets. Once that fear was duct taped, the association to just black folks could be forgotten. And 100 years later, most of us don't even remember the roots of these fears. But just because these drugs were associated with bad behavior and stripped from legal markets, doesn't mean the human desire to get high disappeared. And of course, if you're someone looking to make a profit off that human desire, and if you have some money to invest, you might be tempted to try and find a legal alternative to those drugs which were outlawed. That's exactly what happened, and from the original roots of racism, capitalism took over. Ever since, we've continued to outlaw a drug, replace it with another drug, and eventually outlaw the replacement, only to replace it yet again. And as we've gone down the road of replacement, we've steadily, if inadvertently, made drugs much more dangerous and much less natural at every step. Cocaine was replaced with amphetamine, then methamphetamine. In 1932, Benzedrine inhalers hit the market, and it didn't take long for people to realize you could pull the amphetamine-filled cotton swab out of the device and chew on it for a more intense buzz. So these drugs also fell out of favor decades later. But they too were replaced with stronger synthetic alternatives, Adderall in the case of meth and Ritalin in the case of cocaine, both of which do the same thing in the brain as the original drugs. Of course, Ritalin and Adderall don't generally result in the same issues as street meth when a doctor prescribes them to an adolescent who's struggling with ADHD, like happens hundreds of times every day. But that's because our cultural history, our cultural story, at least for now, it's different for those drugs than it is for coke or meth. We tend to see Ritalin and Adderall as relatively safe prescriptions, even if we also know that people sometimes, quote, abuse them. On the other hand, we see meth and cocaine as dangerous street drugs used by only those who don't care about breaking the law. Those stories impact our experiences on those drugs if and when we ever take them. Cannabis was replaced first with barbiturates, and then, when barbiturates fell out of style, with benzodiazepines. Cannabis was also eventually synthesized in an oral pharmaceutical form of THC called Marinol, but that also doesn't have the same cultural myths as weed does, so those who use it don't have the same experience as those who smoke pot. Of course, with cannabis, the rate of absorption also has something to do with that, since smoking makes any drug hit us super fast, whereas Marinol, like an edible, has to dissolve in our gut. But our stories impact both experiences as much, if not more, than the pharmacodynamics of the actual drug. Perhaps the mother of all pharmaceutical gold mines is opioids, which went from raw smokable opium gum scraped right off the poppy to codeine, hydrocodone, and morphine. But these drugs too were called out as dangerous and addictive in the early 1900s, so they were stigmatized and replaced with a new drug called heroin. That sounds funny to our ears, but when it first hit the market, heroin was sold as a cure for morphine addiction, even though they are effectively the same drug. And because it was sold as a cure for morphine addiction, it sometimes worked as a cure for morphine addiction. But it also left some people in a worse place than when they started, because, as with all of these drugs, the issue is the lies and impossible claims that come with the new drug. So heroin, too, was outlawed, and the pharma companies got to work cooking up all sorts of new forms of the same old drug, a process that eventually led to our current situation with Oxycontin and fentanyls. Of course, we're shocked when we hear that Purdue managed to pass off Oxycontin as less addictive and safer than, well, itself, considering it's just oxycodone, a drug that's been on the market for almost a century. But it passed muster when they originally did it. And since they were following the same old recipe for drug replacement that's long ruled the pharma industry, it seemed like no big deal at the time. Same with fentanyl, which wouldn't be a problem on the streets right now if we hadn't tried so hard to rid the world of morphine, or the heroin that replaced the morphine, or the Oxycontin that replaced much of the heroin in the early 2000s. Every time we outlaw and replace, we find ourselves in a worse situation than we were before. Richard de Grandpre calls this system of promises unkept to replacement by the same drug a cult of pharmacology, because he sees our attitudes and beliefs, our methods of evaluating evidence, as following the same path as it would in a cult. We don't look at reasonable arguments and challenge fishy claims when it comes to a new drug. We see a commercial and we tell our doctor we want to try it, and we honestly expect it to work, even though, as de Grandpre also points out, Literally nothing produced by the pharma industry in the last 100 years has lived up to the claims that were made about it. Not a single drug. So that's the recipe for drug policy updates in the United States. Our human trait of being prone to incredibly convincing placebo effects has left us buying false claims of efficacy only to find that we've been lied to, then doing the same thing again when the hucksters come back around to offer the next bottle of miracle cures. That placebo effect is stronger than just set and setting. I'm not saying that anyone who takes an injection of cocaine won't get high. You almost certainly will. But I'm saying that what high means to you isn't the same as what high means to everyone else. And that's why our recipe for drug replacement is probably going to stay the same way it is now for a long time. The first time I smoked weed, and the last time I smoked weed, just a few seconds ago as a matter of fact, they both felt, from my perspective, very similar. And I consciously didn't think about the stories I was told prior to using in either case. But those stories, in my experience, which is also just a story I'm telling myself about the past in real time, they still and always inform my experience right now. I had a friend who tripped acid with me in 11th grade, and he freaked out, even though I'd taken a lot more than he had, and I was doing just fine, aside from tripping really hard. He started talking to God and repenting, and eventually he ran away into a rainstorm and walked back to his house a mile away, alone in the dark. I didn't understand it at the time, but one of the biggest differences between our experiences was his belief that he was sinning and that God was going to judge him. He'd also been told that LSD causes brain damage and chromosomal deformation, and all of those beliefs, false as they were, they impacted his experience and made his acid very different than my acid. He's okay now, by the way, but that story clearly impacted him that night. The placebo effect even works when there isn't a drug involved at all. Humans are that prone to suggestion. If you bring in a group of people and give them a sugar pill, and you explain it's just a sugar pill, but you also tell them that you want to evaluate whether or not it improves their quality of life, pain management, anxiety, whatever, a rather notable percentage of them will report improvements in their lives, and they'll swear the sugar pill isn't a sugar pill at all, that it's a real drug. Many will want to keep taking it indefinitely even after the study ends. If you tell a daily heroin or methadone user that you're going to decrease their dose, but you keep it the same anyway, you lie to them, they experience detox symptoms. If you let one user shoot up their own dope, but you administer the exact same dose to another without telling them when you give it to them, the one who injects their own drugs will experience less detox than the one who's simply given a dose without warning. Study after study has cleverly shown us just how easy it is to fool humans into thinking they're high, or sober, or better when they're not. But the cult of pharmacology relies on us never admitting that that's just part of our human nature. If we did admit it, Big Pharma and other industries would take a huge hit. Take cigarettes, often considered the most addictive drug on earth. If it was as simple as nicotine being super addictive, then replacement nicotine, through gum or patches or even medications like Chantix, they would work to reduce urges and help people quit smoking. And to be fair, some people do have an easier time putting down cigarettes when they take these substances. But they, too, have their own cultural scripts, which those who take them know before taking them. And everyone who takes them has a different story, and as such, a different experience. But let's skip the quitting stage for now and talk about what's happening when we get addicted to nicotine, because it's not really accurate to say it that way. We don't really get addicted to nicotine so much as we get addicted to smoking, or in some cases to chewing tobacco. And that's because it's such a well-designed habit. Big Tobacco really did its homework to make sure. First, like religion, which is the only drug that can be taken anywhere by anyone at any time, usually without anybody nearby noticing you're taking it, cigarettes are almost just as versatile. And when we smoke while we do something else, it's like adding milk to our coffee or using cruise control to drive. We often come to prefer to drive or drink our coffee with these accessories all the time once we get a taste for them. And then when our coffee doesn't have milk or our rental car doesn't have cruise control, it just feels like something's missing. It's not quite as good as it was. Now think about smoking and when we do it. When we're nervous, when we're bored, when we take a break from work, when we watch TV, when we drive, when we gamble, when we do cocaine. Most smokers associate smoking with something else they do all the time. And when the accessory of smoking goes away, the activity doesn't feel as complete and rewarding as it normally does. So we want to smoke. Addictions are about quality of life and human patterns of behavior. So Big Tobacco's ability to weave cigarettes into so many areas of pre-existing culture, that's the reason they've stuck around so long. Remember, nicotine doesn't get users high, aside from maybe an early morning 2-second buzz that comes with the first cigarette of the day. But that's a selling point of sorts too, since, like religion, it's also one of the few drugs that you can't get too high on to work. But smoking is also about a lot more than just accessorizing other human activities. It's also about accessorizing you. Your brand is your brand, even though it probably isn't all that different from many others. We don't just smoke to feel a certain way. We smoke a certain brand to be associated with that brand. Newport smokers describe themselves differently than Marlboro smokers. And everything that goes with that is also ritualistic, and as such, addicting. The smack of the pack against your hand before you open it, the pulling off of the plastic seal, the flip of one lucky cigarette upside down to save for last, the tapping of a single cigarette out and the setting it in your lips, the flick of the lighter. It's all ritual, and it's all built into our daily lives. And don't forget the taste. It's not tobacco, but it's good. They sweeten it, they make it stronger, they get rid of any bitter flavors that would turn you off. They strip out the nicotine and then replace it artificially to both regulate the levels and jack them up. And they do it all in a way that sort of disappears unless you keep looking right at it, leaving smokers with the placebo story that nicotine is so addictive they just can't quit, even though many try the replacement medications and gums only to realize they don't really help. That's because it's not the nicotine we're addicted to, or at least it's not just the nicotine. It's the entire process of smoking. I'm curious to see how companies like Juul and other popular e-cigarette brands have navigated this same space in a new venue. Like, there doesn't appear to be much, if any, smell from the pods if you're in a room with somebody who's using one. But presumably, the manufacturers were smart enough to test different thicknesses of vapor, different flavors of smoke, different types of aroma, even if they aren't consciously detectable. And unlike Big Tobacco, who is doing this from scratch, e-cigarette companies have a guidebook on what to avoid if they want to prevent that ton of lawsuits from blowing up on them that blew up on Big Tobacco. So I'm guessing they're being pretty clever about it. If you're looking for a graduate school project, it's all yours. Humans are programmed machines that are designed to avoid noticing that programming. It's not just drugs, it's everything. But pulling at those strings and forcing ourselves to look in the mirror and grasp a bit about what's going on behind the scenes lets us take control of things that otherwise feel like they're out of control. That's the real goal of this project. Love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce.
People get better when they take the drug, but it's not the chemical ingredients of the drug that are making them better. It's largely the placebo effect.
If you're still here, you might want more. So consider checking out my book, Dr. Junkie, One Man's Story of Addiction and Crime that will challenge everything you know about the war on drugs. You can get it wherever you buy books. If you want to know what the world would look like if drugs were legal, or why we develop tolerance and sensitization to drugs when we take them for extended periods, or if you just want to know why I went to prison, check out the book.